Second force. In examining how long it takes to see that difficulties can be taken in a work way, how we can be tempted without noting it, simply because one takes difficulties as if they should not exist, we see that difficulty, the force of resistance, is present everywhere, running throughout the texture of life and present even within ourselves. P.D. Ouspensky noted that in trying to study second force, it is best to begin to try to observe it in oneself. Everyone has inner difficulties but does not recognize them as being due to second force, taking this simply as impediments from which we feel perhaps that we suffer unfairly. We all say, if only this, if only that, and so on. The idea of second force is expressed in one of the laws of motion of Newtonian physics, where it is said that, quote, "To every force, there is an equal and opposite force." The laws that this work formulates as being fundamental, in other words the law of three and the law of octaves, exist both in nature and within ourselves. When reflecting in this manner, the law of three does not claim that to every force there is an equal and opposite force, but that in every manifestation there are three forces at work. An active force or the initiating force, a passive force or the force of resistance, and neutralizing force, which connects the two otherwise antagonistic opposing forces, so that something happens, a manifestation takes place. But for the third force, the other two forces, being equal and opposite, would simply produce a static state of affairs, through being interlocked, like the horns of two equally powerful stags. It is the third force that, by making a fulcrum, makes things possible, which brings opposing things into harmony, making use of otherwise irreconcilable opposites. The work teaches that if we begin to see second force in ourselves, we may catch a glimpse of third force, however initially we must see first force. Will, as defined in the work, lies in finding solutions, and not the negation of something. When we see some form of second force operating in our lives, something that prevents us from attaining certain objects or things that could be regarded as first and active force, something that keeps standing in our way, our situation demands a solution, and not simply a denying. It is precisely here that an act of will begins, in the reconciling of the situation. We cannot do away with second force through violence, because it will only grow stronger. However, we may be able to adopt the position of peacemaker, in some way make it cooperate with active force, through something new, or a change in our attitude toward the situation, as third force. One of the most liberating experiences is to realize how much useless second force we create in ourselves, owing to our attitudes and imagination. How endless forms of second force arise, simply because we do not realize that we possess a number of attitudes and forms of expectancy, which we do not observe. Many of us are entitled, which makes us act in a way such as to complicate everything in our lives, through the creation of so much unnecessary and blind negativity. To separate oneself a little from some of their attitudes, from some ingrained prejudices, and finally even from the power of some buffers, if this is possible, is to experience a new degree of freedom that is difficult to describe. We realize that we have been in the power of something that has never been suspected, noticing that we no longer have the same kind of artificial difficulties to face. Such an experience makes it possible to see our lives in the past more consciously, because when there is a shift of our psychological state through an increase of consciousness, an expansion of self-awareness of what we are like, then we can see our life in the past more distinctly, from this liberated and more conscious vantage. We cannot see our life as it has been formed by our level of being, from the exact same level of being. We are unable, for example, to see how extraordinarily foolish we have been in 1,001 ways, or how unnecessarily complicated we have made certain things. Unless a new point of consciousness is born within us, from which to look back and see, you will not be able to see because you have nothing to see with, and no new vantage point. However, if something has changed in us, and we have hence so far been liberated from a certain attitude towards ourselves, towards others, or towards life, then we will be able to see how this attitude has worked in us throughout our lives, and know one meaning of the sentence. Your level of being attracts your life. It's an interesting experience. That change of attitude, or the freeing of oneself from some attitude, will change the nature of second force in our life. Full will is defined technically in this work as being connected with the power of being conscious in all three forces together. On occasion it is said that we are not even conscious in one force, still less in two, and never in three. This is partly to do with the fact that we mostly think of just one thing at a time, finding it difficult to think in terms of two concepts. Impossible to think in terms of three all at once. However, this is not quite the same as full will, because being conscious in a force is not the same as thinking about it, just as being conscious of the truth of something is not the same as having conviction about it. Being conscious in the state of self-remembering is not the same as thinking about self-remembering. To be conscious in first force is to know what we want. To be conscious in second force is to know what difficulties stand in the way of fulfilling this desire, and to be conscious in third force at the same time is to be conscious of how what we want and what opposes it could eventually be reconciled. Each force modifies the other, so much so that in the final solution, the result is never what we set out to attain. It is never like the active force with which it embarked. Nor, on the other hand, are the difficulties the same as we first encountered, before the necessary third force or neutralizing force entered into our conscious sphere of experience, adjusting the relations of first and second forces so as to make some manifestation possible. All this may sound very hypothetical, however it is not so and actually quite practical. It can be experienced up to a point even now, if we know what to look for, and if we have the patience to do so. We must firstly be conscious as far as is possible, in what corresponds to first force. That is, taking the forces as they act within us. Psychologically, we must be conscious in what we want, what we wish, and what we expect. By making this force conscious, instead of merely thinking about it, which we often do through the process of inner dialogue, as well as self-observation over a considerable period of time, we can become aware of second force, that is inevitably called up by the particular quality of the first force that we have, by what we want. Each active force calls up its own second force. If we are in a hurry, everyone will appear to be moving very slowly. If we wish to move slowly, then everyone else will appear to be in a rush. When we live for a time in the consciousness of what we want, then we will at the same time see more and more of the second force that it gives rise to, and so the more we become conscious in two forces simultaneously. We can see therefore that we cannot do this or that because of something or other. More importantly, we shall see why. By not identifying with either, and this we practically always do, which spoils the entire experience, we may catch a glimpse of third force entering as if by magic, which makes the first and second force come into juxtaposition, so they are no longer felt as opposing forces, or as conflicting opposites. This is resolution. And we notice that it has to do with will. Will that has three aspects in itself, or three forces propelling it, and conscious will being therefore consciousness in all three forces, which leads to an act of full will. While this is beyond us at present, it is nonetheless possible on a small scale. However, we take a one-sided view of will, and conceive of it always as something that cuts away, which divides, prohibits, that is harsh, intolerant, unyielding, negating, and therefore sticking to one invariable course. We need to see that will from the work point of view refers to something responding, something flexible and intelligent, that is not one-sided but three-sided. Will is of course from master or real I in us, and this we cannot expect to know directly just as yet. As long as we are one-sided in every sense, nothing can come from that upper level from which the influences of real I emerge, which gives us our real meaning and inner peace. We must at least learn to have double thinking, to see things from different sides and to externally consider. Not only to see the difficulties of other people by putting ourselves in their places, which is a definite conscious act, but also to see the difficulties in ourselves without identifying, as objectively as possible, because in this way we get a new feeling of ourselves, and a new and more flexible sense of what we are. This has a strange effect on anyone, due to an increase of consciousness or light within them, and is really the beginning of the action of this work upon us. We often feel that we are up against things. People live in this state all of their lives. It then becomes necessary, as through inner dialogue with oneself, to ask, what is it that I am up against? Find out what it is that you think you are up against, because what we feel lies in opposition to us is due to what we want. We might simply be filled with impossible and vague desires that create useless second force, so producing in us equally vague feelings of resistance to our will and of being up against everything. If that's the case, then we have to begin to become more conscious in first force, in what it is that we really need, and not what we think we want. This sharpens our mind and makes us become practical. However, things are of course never that easy. At the same time, it is not right or good to live always in a vague sense of being lost, of disappointment, and of looking back. This eats up force. So we must ask ourselves, where are you? What do you want? What is the matter with you? What makes you wish for this, and why do you become like that? Such harsh questioning of oneself becomes increasingly necessary in this work.